Oh, it's the tuk-tuk. Start the tuk-tuk. India win by 5.
Hello and welcome to episode 53 of the Anti-Indian Cricket Agenda, also known to many as Radio Cricket. Yes, that is 53, the same number of death threats I received as soon as James Treadwell failed to hit a six off the final ball of the Champions Trophy final, thus handing India a much-deserved title. I'm Nishant Joshi, a name that approximately translates into Sanskrit and Hindi as sunrise, end of the night, or according to several of our followers, the evil antichrist of Indian cricket. I'm joined by the man with a far more Indian name than mine. It is the one, the only, these Indian ethnic names are so hard to pronounce. It is James Marsh.
Yes, Nishant, ironically my birth name is actually Laxman Shivarama Krishnan, but I changed it to James to make it easier for Indians to pronounce. But yes, Nishant, you've alluded there to your somewhat pessimistic prediction ahead of the tournament about India. I've noticed a few people have picked up on it on Twitter, and I've just collected a selection of the things you've been called in the last 24 hours.
Really, James? I hadn't noticed. Please do enlighten us.
Well, I thought it might have passed you by. So you've been called a disgrace to cricket experts. You've been called a moron who deserves every tiny bit of abuse. You've been called a wanker. Very old school, that one. But most fascinatingly of all, you've been called a kangaroo. So
really? Someone called me a kangaroo?
Yeah, indeed. So I don't know. I hope you still got a bit of spring in your step. So just talk us through what it's been like, what you made of India's performance and your own personal experience on Twitter in the last couple of days.
Well, I tell you, James, it is totally refreshing to actually be proven wrong by good cricket. It is cleansing and it is humbling as well. It does remind you that whatever logic you apply to your predictions, no matter how balanced you attempt to be, no matter how logical you attempt to be, it does kind of underline the fact that sport can never be predicted, unless, of course, we are talking about the IPL. And I'm glad to see that our legions of Indian fans, we literally have millions, judging by the response I've been getting on Twitter. I'm glad to see that all of our Indian fans, and even some of our Pakistani fans who've been joining in for good measure, have reminded me of my pre-tournament thoughts of how I thought that India would fare. And I tell you, James, I've had humble pie in my life, but I tell you, humble pie never tasted so much like garam masala. And boy, do I know, I've had it stuffed down my mouth in the last 24 hours.
Well, I hope you were able to swallow that humble pie. Okay, Nishant, otherwise you would have been joining Charles Saatchi and England as the week's biggest chokers, of course, because we saw a quite astounding finish to the Champions Trophy on Sunday afternoon. Because of the fairly typical British summer, it had looked at one stage as if it was going to be the worst covers-based disappointment since Take That did a version of Smells Like Teen Spirit. And as was noted on Twitter, there was no reserve day, of course, and so people did start to get a little bit miffed that they weren't going to be able to see Anderson versus Dhawan on Monday because there was going to be James Franklin versus Jadejageddon back on Tuesday. But anyway, we did eventually get a game, and what a thrilling game it was. It came down to England needing 20 off just 16 balls, but somehow they contrived to lose 4 wickets in 7 balls, and key to this was actually the over of Ishant Sharma. There was a lot of comment on Twitter, as usual, asking why Dhoni had so much faith in him, but he got Owen Morgan with the classic village wide, telegraph slower ball 3-card trick, and then had Bafara caught hooking next ball, who bizarrely thought he wasn't out because the ball was above head height. And there's actually a clip of umpire Dharma Sena laughing at him for not knowing the law properly.
Well, James, it was a final that turned out to be more dramatic than a soap opera of Ravi Shastri's life, and as you alluded to, it did threaten to become a rain-affected farce, thanks to the incompetence of the organisers. For a large part of the day, it seemed like we'd have India and England as joint holders of the Champions Trophy, simply because there was no reserve day for the final. And the reason given for the lack of reserve day was that it would clash with England's T20 series with New Zealand, a series that people give less of a fuck about than a Ramiz Raja commentary stint. But in the end, India ended up as deserved winners of the Champions Trophy, and it's fair to say that they were the best side throughout the tournament. They won all of their 5 matches. Ravi Jadeja appropriately won the tournament's Golden Ball Award, and no, that's not just something I made up. And Shikhar Dhawan finished the tournament as leading run scorer by a comfortable distance. And James, all this means that as captain, MS Dhoni has now won the T20 World Cup, the ODI World Cup, several IPLs, the Champions League T20 and the Champions Trophy. He also took India to number 1 in the world in tests, making him the most successful Indian captain, well, ever. And James, a lot of people will rightly praise India's bowling and batting throughout this tournament, but I'd say that the common theme running through this Indian team this time around was urgency. The running between the wickets was excellent, and for the first time ever, India can lay claim to having the best fielding side in the world. That is, of course, if you exclude Nishant Sharma, who still bends over to pick up a ball about as gracefully as a baby giraffe on ice. So yes, India fully deserved the Champions Trophy. They were head and shoulders above the competition, and hopefully Nishant Sharma will now finally get that haircut we've all been waiting for.
Well, indeed, Nishant, I think India were head and shoulders above the rest, and as you say, there was this sense of urgency to them, and I think there should be a lot of credit going to Trevor Penny, the fielding coach, who of course was back at Edgbaston, where he enjoyed such a fine county career with Warwickshire. I think there's also a sense of calmness and consistency to India. Again, we have to put that down to, I think, Dhoni's zen, and if you look at it, they went unchanged for 5 consecutive ODIs, which equals India's record for the most matches with the same starting 11. Just coming back to those 2 individuals you mentioned, Dhawan won the Golden Bat. He got 363 runs in 5 games with 2 centuries and 29 devilish 12s of his moustache, which is also an Indian record. He also hit 4 sixes, which is the 3rd highest in the tournament, which also included 1 uppercut in the final with both feet off the ground. A shot of such magnificent aesthetic splendour, it made Sangakkara's hair look like Ishant's. Coming on to the other moustache, of course, Jadeja also performed outstandingly well and ended as the leading wicket taker in the tournament, winning the Golden Ball, as you say, which does sound more like a medical condition than a prize. But anyway, he took 2 for 24 in his 4 overs in the final, and his contribution with the bat was also crucial as well. He made 33 of 25 balls, and obviously that proved crucial to the outcome. And such is Jadeja's magnificence, it's getting to the stage where the only challenge left for him, Nishant, will be to score a 100 in an ODI. And just one other point of note is I was quite pleased to see Duncan Fletcher do well. As an England fan, I've obviously got very pleasant memories of how he transformed my national team, and after all the buckets of manure tipped over his head by India fans after the 8-0 defeat in England and Australia, it was quite nice to see him finally coming up smelling of roses.
Well, yes, James, it's very appropriate you mentioned 2 men at the centre of Indian cricket there who have been pilloried in recent times. I mean, firstly, starting off with Ravi Jadeja, what a turnaround it's been for him. I mean, if we go back just 4 years to the T20 World Cup in 2009, where India were facing a target of 154 against England in T20 at Lords, and Ravi Jadeja came in at number 4, and he looked utterly hopeless, looked like he was totally out of his depth, and he played what most people consider to be a match-losing knock of 25 off 35 balls, and that really put India behind the 8 ball. And you fast forward 4 years, and he's come through so much since then. I think he's turning into the sort of all-rounder who's really going to become a frontline bowler who can bat a bit, and I think that's going to be incredibly useful for India going forward to South Africa especially. A lot of people were wondering whether he would actually be able to fit into the side along with Ashwin, whether you could have 2 spinners in England. I think that Jadeja's proved all his doubters wrong, and that he, especially in the test side as well, he could well become a permanent fixture away from home as well, which is going to be a huge bonus for India's balance looking forward, especially looking at him as a number 7 batsman in the future. And of course, the other man you mentioned, James, Duncan Fletcher, he's been the man subject to a fair bit of abuse, especially after India's 8-0 test defeat a couple of years ago, which seemed a very long time ago. It's amazing how quickly time flies in the context of cricket. And he's endured a very tough tournament. His mother passed away, and he is the type of man, I like to call him the photographer of cricket, because he's a type of behind the scenes man. He's the type of guy who won't get any credit when things go well, but when the shit hits the fan, he's going to be the type of guy who's going to be facing a lot of heat. And so I think that he's going to route his job with a lot of class, a lot of dignity. I mean, we experienced what he was like with the English cricket team as well. It was the same kind of story over there, and he led them to a lot of success. So I think it was great to see Duncan Fletcher kind of prove his doubters wrong, and it was really touching to see at the end as well, Virat Kohli bending over to touch Duncan Fletcher's feet as a mark of respect, just as India were doing their lap of honour. And the cute thing about that was that when Virat Kohli was bending over, I think Duncan Fletcher kind of shirked for a moment because he was afraid that Virat Kohli was actually going to try and pick him up, which would have probably resulted in Virat Kohli being out of action for quite a while. Australia in dis-a-fucking-ray news now, and James, I know how you're always disappointed to hear news of the old enemy struggling in their attempts to regain the Ashes, but you must have been especially disappointed and disheartened today to hear that Australia have sacked their coach Mickey Arthur, ostensibly after a poor series resulting in a Champions Trophy first round exit. They have replaced Mickey Arthur with Darren Lehmann, current coach of the Brisbane Heat. So, James, what do you make of this Aussie Omnishambles?
Well, it's hard to know what to make of it, Nishant, but I mean, people criticise Mickey Arthur for his apparent knee-jerk reaction during Homework Gate. So I suppose for him there's something of a cruel irony in the fact that a knee-jerk reaction seems to have ended his days as coach. Australia are about as united as the two Koreas at present, and even Kim Jong-un possibly thinks James Sutherland has acted in a slightly bizarre and overly authoritarian manner. From the point of view of galvanising the side, I think Lehmann's somewhat more, shall we say, liberal approach to team management will help, but the fact remains that in the last year the Australian squad has seen more splits than Rory Kleinveld's trousers. Warner and Watson allegedly make James Anderson and Kevin Peterson look like Warne and Liz Hurley, and the captain himself even managed to allegedly have a bust-up with Mike Hussey on the day of his international retirement because Mr. Cricket wanted beers in the dressing room and Pup wanted the team to go out for a party on a yacht. And basically, Nishant, on the choppy waters of Australia cricket, you could say that Darren Lehmann has been asked to take over the controls of the Titanic after the iceberg has already hit. He's a former coach of, God rest their soul, the Deccan Chargers, and is known for his people management skills, which are likely to find him offering players a beer rather than a self-assessment sheet. He's a former Wisdom Player of the Year from his hugely successful time at Yorkshire, so his knowledge of English pitches can't be questioned, but I suppose what can be is whether this Australia squad needs even more discipline to tighten it up, or can they just take the Ian Chappell route and sort things out over a 4X, which, for anyone who isn't aware, that's the Australian brand of beer which Lehmann represents, not what David Warner calls journalists on Twitter. Nishant, I must admit I am a bit bemused at the timing of this. What were your own thoughts?
Well, James, in my opinion, I think that Mickey Arthur has been made somewhat of a scapegoat here by Cricket Australia and their setup, which it seems to be quite a cosmetic thing to be sacking Mickey Arthur just 2 weeks before the Ashes. It seems like, for me, the Cricket Australia CEO James Sutherland, it seems like to save his own job, he needs to give off the impression that he's actually doing something and taking some decisive action. Whereas, in fact, decisive action would have been to appoint Darren Lehmann ahead of Mickey Arthur when the call needed to be made. And that would have been decisive and brave. But as it turns out, Mickey Arthur wasn't as good a fit for the Australian team as had been hoped. I mean, behind the scenes, the rumours do abound that Mickey Arthur was pretty much abhorred at the level of indiscipline in the Australian setup, especially compared to the rather professional, kind of self-sufficient South African setup from where he came. And overall, I do have a lot of sympathy with Mickey Arthur because this current Australian side is being referred to as the uncoachables, something which does kind of ring true when you look at the past few months, where Mickey Arthur seems kind of desperate in his different sort of ways at approaching this Australian side. But at the end of the day, they just don't seem to want to play ball with him. I mean, all he asked for was 3 simple points as part of his infamous homework assignment, which 4 people couldn't even be bothered to turn in. And you look at the latest incident, David Warner punching Joe Root in a walkabout, just hours after getting thrashed by England in the Champions Trophy. I mean, I do have a lot of sympathy for Mickey Arthur and the way he's been treated by his players. I don't think that they've given him enough respect. I don't think that Cricket Australia have given him enough support, going by reports. And it does seem like for a few months now, Darren Lehmann has been lined up as Mickey Arthur's replacement. I did tweet in February that the rumours I was hearing is that Darren Lehmann had already been approached back in February to replace Mickey Arthur. So I do think that Mickey Arthur has been blackballed somewhat, and he was pretty much facing a cul-de-sac in this Australian appointment.
Well, indeed, Nishant, it is a sorry state of affairs, but it's not all doom and gloom, because appearing over the horizon like a duck-faced peroxide cowboy coming to save his village is the mighty Steve Smith, who, in possibly the one sensible decision made by someone in authority in Australian cricket in the last couple of months, has been added to their Ashes squad.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode of Radio Cricket. Thank you very much for joining us once again and throughout this Champions Trophy. Do remember you can catch us on soundcloud.com/Radio Cricket or on iTunes. Just search for Radio Cricket or the Anti-Indian Cricket Agenda, and I'm sure we'll pop up right there. So from me, until next week, I've been Nishant Joshi.
And I've been James Marsh. And I leave you with the happy news that Srisanth is getting married. They haven't decided on the spot, but the date's already been fixed. Goodbye.
I think it was a very poor performance. One of the worst things I have ever seen done on a cricket field. Good night.